Afternoon, everyone. My name is Jörn Fischer. I'm a professor at the Social-Ecological Systems Institute, which is part of the School of Sustainability at Leuphana University, Lüneburg. And we're here today to discuss ideas around regeneration within the context of social-ecological systems. Regeneration, regenerative dynamics, regenerative sustainability, these are all terms we now hear increasingly frequently, and they're increasingly popular ideas in different fields. So, for example, we might hear of regenerative economy or of regenerative business, or we might try to regenerate our minds and souls, or we might try to boost the natural regeneration of ecosystems. So since regeneration appears to be an increasingly popular idea, it seems like a good time to get together some interesting speakers and all of you from all different parts of the world here to better understand what's behind this idea of regenerative systems. So I'm looking forward to the conversations we're going to have, and for now I'll hand over directly to Manu to start with.
Thank you, Jörn. Hi, everyone. Very happy to see so many people joining the conversation. Thank you very much. My name is Manuel Pacheco, and I am postdoctoral researcher at the University of Almeria in Spain, and I also visiting scientist at the Social-Ecological Systems Institute of Leuphana University. And I will take just a couple of minutes to let you know that within the recently founded Society for Social-Ecological Systems, the so-called SOCSES, we have created a working group on regenerative social ecological systems, which is in turn part of a broader thematic stream on transformative change processes. I invite you to take a look at the website that is still developing, read more about the society and our working group, and even become a member if you are interested. So this global conversation is sort of a launching activity of our working group so that you can learn more about the regenerative social ecological systems approach and also some of the key aspects of this field that we would like to investigate more in the coming years. And also let me inform you about that in the near future we have planned another activity which will be more applied, and this will be a breakout session on regenerative social ecological systems archetypes, which will happen at the 8th International Workshop on Archetype Analysis in Sustainability Research. This will be a hybrid workshop, so you can attend both in person or online. That will happen at the Thunen Institute of Biodiversity in Germany. For those who are already interested or become interested after this global conversation of today, we encourage you to join us for the workshop in September. The registration is free and will be open very soon. So that's all from my side, and now I give the floor to my colleague Roman, who will introduce the speakers of today and explain the dynamics of this global conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Manu. Welcome also from my side. My name is Roman Isaac. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at CESI, and I would like to introduce our speakers today. So first up is Professor Stefan Fani, who is Professor for Business Administration at the Institute for Management and Organization here at Leuphana University. His research focuses on understanding entrepreneurship and disruptions, for example, natural disasters or biodiversity loss, and entrepreneurship and sustainability transformations. Second, we have Dr. Victoria Gutierrez, who is the head of global policy at Commonland, based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Commonland is a not-for-profit organization that brings people together to restore degraded landscapes and regenerate them. Commonland supports projects around the globe with their holistic landscape restoration approach, the Four Returns framework. And finally, Dr. Caitlin McElroy is a departmental research lecturer at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment and the School of Geography and the Environment at Oxford University. Her research in the Regeneration Lab brings together research and business to build the knowledge and practices necessary for a regenerative economy. This webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, and we'll first hear individual 10-minute presentations by each of our speakers, and then we'll go into 12-minute long breakout rooms to which you can assign yourself. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Stefan.
So I hope everyone can see my slides. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. What I've planned for today for the next 10 minutes is two things. First, I would like to introduce you to the regenerative dynamics framework, which is the result of a collective effort of several people of Leuphana University, Jörn Fischer, Dave Epson, Berta Martin-Lopez, I saw also Maria von Salisch online, and some others, which has been published in Nature Sustainability last year. And then I would like to take this framework and see how this can be useful for doing research in entrepreneurship and organizations at large, if you want to say so. Yeah, my focus, as was introduced by Roman, is on social and sustainable entrepreneurship. So you might already recognize that even though regeneration is a term and concept that's used across many disciplines, we are using slightly different terminology. So bear with me if I'm saying and explaining things slightly differently from maybe how you are used to, but the ideas are essentially the same. So what is the starting point of this work? And it is perhaps a recognition that we are living in a world where we have degenerative system dynamics going on around us. And you are very familiar, I guess, with the planetary boundaries concept, which is already giving us a very clear indication that we are overshooting biophysical thresholds. And if you're looking at social indicators, you will also notice that development is not going across most of these thresholds in the right direction. And the second recognition is that the model we are currently basing our hopes on is a model that says that we can grow in a green way and thereby achieve what you could say a sustainable and perhaps equitable and way of development. However, research so far is pretty clear on this, that this is largely a myth. So we have not seen in practice that the decoupling of natural resource use and achieving high levels of development is working, which is indicated by the figure on the right. So these are just two of many figures I could have been showing to suggest that we are seeing by and large that we are living in a world full of degenerative system dynamics. So what could we be doing with this? And if you are interested in resilience, you might say, well, we have to become better in bouncing back from these shocks. But like myself, who has been studying several disasters, bouncing back and maintaining functioning, so being resilient in a system that's largely locked in degenerative dynamics, is not really desirable. And I think the term regeneration tries to shift our perspective perhaps in another direction. So this is one commonly used figure across many disciplines, which tries to suggest that regeneration is something else than sustainability or restoration, for that matter. So the idea is that regeneration goes beyond minimizing harm, which at least in the business world and economics is the dominant focus on sustainability, you could say. So it's trying to achieve net positive development, indicated here on the right. So we are trying to restore and regenerate something beyond the current status. So it shifts our focus from growing a quantity in something towards thriving. And I think the planetary boundaries concept shows you that we need to do that. But this has been adapted in economics, for instance, by the donut economy model. And Kate Raworth is very firm on saying we are obsessed with growth. We are addicted to growth for growth's sake, whether we thrive or not. But instead, what we should be doing is we should be trying to thrive, whether we are growing or not. And this is the shift that we see is necessary. And I would largely associate that with regeneration. Also, it's a focus on potentiality. So it's a more future-oriented concept, and it's a bit more hopeful than some of the other terms around. So trying to look at, okay, instead of measuring certain outcomes, what are the tendencies, the dynamics that we have to set in place in order to move in a better direction, you could say. And first and foremost, it is assuming a system approach. So system dynamics, where we see everything being coupled, is essentially recognized by regeneration research across disciplines. So what we have been doing in this paper is to see, first of all, regardless of the terms that we're using, can we find a common framing and conceptual foundation that is largely applicable to most areas of research on regeneration, whether that's on psychology, economics, social ecological systems, and so on. And to our surprise, yes, by and far, you could say that the general tendencies and dynamics are the same across disciplines. So with regeneration, we really would like to focus on the process of renewal or recreation of a certain desired outcome. And that is due to having regenerative dynamics in place. So focusing on when a system undergoes repeated events of renewal in a desirable direction, that is what we would like to call regenerative dynamics. So we need to focus on the direction in these dynamics, but also recognize what is the general system state that we are in. So are we in a regenerative or degenerative momentum? And as I initially said, mostly we are seeing that systems are locked in or on towards a more degenerative momentum. So the notion here is that we are able to set in place dynamics where, without having to put in more additional energy, whether this is humans or anthropogenic practices or dynamics, or non-anthropogenic ones like sun energy, for instance, that basically the momentum would be on a self-renewing and self-sustaining dynamic. In order to do that, we need regenerative practices. So these are conscious actions that try to shift at certain points in the system the direction of the system. And this largely is based on agency of the actors, also of non-human or more than human actors, and recognizing that we cannot look at isolated effects, but at the mutualistic interaction. So the outcomes both for ecological systems, for instance, for social systems and interconnected systems. But you might say, well, the world is already full of regenerative practices. When you read at least business reports, that's what is being suggested. So I would like to sharpen some of these ideas a little bit and maybe tie it to my own research. So regenerative practices in isolation are not enough. This is the bottom line of this, and I want to give 3 examples. So when you read at least corporates making statements on reforestation, that is always considered to be a regenerative practice. But whether it really is regenerative depends on the social ecological system, because whether the trees are able to grow and whether they are maintained and they serve also the local community dynamics is not, is absolutely a must. So you cannot just reuse it to the practice itself, but you need to see at the interconnected systems. The same goes with the example of car sharing of electric vehicles, which is another example that many see as a regenerative practice. Whether this actually leads to a reduction in total emissions and longer use and the ability of reusing these materials is something that needs to be accounted for as well. And I would say another very striking example is, for example, the example of ocean plastic shoes, where organizations suggest that by recycling, by using wild plastics or collecting plastic that's already out there in nature and putting that into products, you have regenerative practices in place. And that completely disregards, first of all, whether other parts of the shoe, such as, for instance, the sole, so the lower part, are made of materials that are biodegradable. So the critique here is mostly that they are not seeing the material circle being connected to the technical one with the biological one, because the shoe is still polluting the environment. So these are just 3 examples to say that in order to really judge whether these regenerative practices are in favor or supporting regenerative system dynamics, we need to have this systemic perspective. But you might argue and critique us and say, well, we have already, at least in business and management since about a decade, largely taken a systems perspective. And here I would like to sharpen maybe our thinking of the different types of system perspectives that are prevalent. So the one that dominates the business sphere and is underlying the green growth paradigm is the one on the left corner, which is the sustainable one. And here, largely the rationale is that it's social technical systems that have to be set in the right direction. So think about the car sharing idea here, and that would score towards 3 different types of bottom lines. So an ecological one, a social one, economic one. So there would be a return on investment here. So that's the dominant one, and it disregards to a large extent the biosphere. but I will wrap up soon. And then in the lower part, we see, for instance, the circular economy model, which already is closer because the understanding here of the different loops is that you are closing two loops, which is the biological one, so the biosphere, and the technological one. So it's about material productivity. However, what we are suggesting here in the paper is really a systems approach based on regenerative thinking. So it's based on social ecological systems thinking and aims for planetary well-being and health, and thereby clearly can be distinguished from, for instance, the circular economy debate and the way system approaches are mostly used in sustainable, at least sustainability studies in business and management. And I will just use a few seconds on saying how you can be using this. So for instance, in my own research, since this is so new, I would like to see that we are seeing organization as regenerative systems, which is on the left at the bottom, the last point. However, we are not there yet, and we only see examples such as community-supported agriculture organizations that could perhaps be labeled as such. So we are beginning to see what you can maybe call regenerative thinking in entrepreneurship, so which is taking a bunch of these principles that I just said and see how, for instance, the business cycle and natural cycles have to be synchronized, etc. So I'm looking forward to discussing some of these further, and I will use my last slide to advertise a little bit. You would hear from Caitlin later on as well, the need to establish new structures at universities, and at Leuphana we are since a few months starting the Regenerative Entrepreneurial Action Lab, which will be launched soon. And here we try to take these principles into education, which you can see on the right. So different kind of incubation processes, different kind of education of our master students, as well as rethinking some of the research we are doing in a more transdisciplinary way, where we are evaluating the impact, for instance. Happy to talk more about this. I have, already sketched out a few things we can later discuss, but I don't want to take more of your time for now. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Stefan. And we will post the questions after the talk, so you guys can choose the breakout rooms you'll go to. Next, we will hear from Victoria. Victoria, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
And you can see the presentation.
Yeah, but it's not in full presentation mode.
Now,
Yes, it is.
continue. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Very interesting discussion I think we're going to have later. I'm really pleased to be able to join this conversation. So thank you very much to the organizers. So I'm going to be talking about how the thinking around regenerative dynamics can be brought into and applied to the landscape restoration, ecosystem restoration space. And to do that, I'm going to talk about a specific example of landscape restoration a framework and its application in the real world. And I'm going to be talking about the full returns framework because that's the one I'm working with. And yeah, so let's begin by taking a quick look at the bigger picture. I think it's always good to start thinking about the biggest challenge of our time, which is the poly crisis, that connects all these bigger global systems and sees them as interconnected: environment, health, food, social order, economy, energy, etc. In addressing this notion of polycrisis, we typically identify these distinct global systems, but pinpointing their boundaries remains a challenge because complex systems are by definition interactive, they change and they co-evolve. So when we think about ecosystem restoration, which is increasingly being considered as a vital entry point for tackling the polycrisis, and just in case, because I'm not sure who's in the room, By ecosystem restoration, I mean the processes and activities that relate to halting and reversing ecosystem degradation, that results in improved ecosystem services and recovered biodiversity. And we can do that along a continuum of restoration, which involves various degrees of recovery. But in addressing ecosystem restoration, very often what we find is that the scale of implementation is very often overlooked in international frameworks. And I think this matters in this conversation because the scale of implementation is directly related to what kind of systems we can work with while we implement. So I want to talk about landscape approaches, and these are, of course, operating at the landscape scale, which considers that these are socio-ecological systems that consist of interconnected natural and human-modified land and water ecosystems. They are influenced distinctively by ecological, historical, political, cultural processes and activities. So they have multiple layers that shape them, and therefore they can be considered socio-ecological systems that integrate these ecological, social, economic goals across sectors and scale. So it makes them very interesting in looking at socio-ecological systems. They are also, for this reason, quite good, well positioned to address the root causes of degradation and therefore support transformative change. They can also support policy integration by being able to tackle the trade-offs across different land and water users, working across sectors and subsystems. And they have been said to be quite useful to really deliver an integrated approach of the Rio Convention's frameworks and the targets. And so if we map all the various targets across the 3 Rio Conventions, biodiversity, land degradation, and climate, then we can come up with a very long list. I provide here a few of the targets that are the sort of the key ones, priorities for all of them. But we could possibly map ecosystem restoration at landscape scale across all SDGs directly and indirectly. So the framework that I want to sort of talk about here is the 4 returns framework, which guides the work that Common Land does across 23 plus countries. And what it very much does is it examines on one hand, the processes that are necessary, nonlinear processes that can be classed into 5 elements that look at how bottom-up processes and approaches that bring together multi-stakeholder partnerships can create a joint vision, lead to a shared understanding, develop a joint integrated plan, implement it, monitor, develop, learn from it, adapt it, and so on. So this is about the process, but it also looks at the type of holistic, broad range of returns, impacts, or benefits that landscapes are likely to seek. And so these are typically the social, the natural, and the financial, but it also integrates a 4th, which is less commonly explicitly integrated, which is the return of inspiration. And this refers to ways in which we can actively generate a sense of place attachment or collective identity, creating a sense of belonging and hope. So these are the 4 returns. And also the implementation of the framework emphasizes the importance of spatial planning, and we simplify this in talking about 3 different zones that need to be acknowledged in landscapes, which include natural zones, productive zones, and economic zones. And to do all of this, we take a long-term approach, which we say it has to be at least a 20-year commitment. And so what we've recently done within this group, within this thematic group, is submit a paper that really examines these ideas of the regenerative dynamic thinking into really applying it into this framework, and what would it look like, and what can we learn from it. Is the 4 returns in its application regenerative, and how does it show up? And so we've recently submitted this paper. It's still under review, but it looks at both scenarios of degenerative degenerative and regenerative potential under certain conditions. So we assume that you can have degenerative dynamics occurring in landscapes. On the left, you can see that degeneration in one domain can affect other degeneration in other domains. And on the right, what we're pursuing is, through the 4 returns, is creating regenerative dynamics in one domain that can filter through other domains. And so we're thinking about ways in which these interactions can be captured and fostered on the ground. And here we can visualize this a little bit better. What we are looking at is ways in which we can arrange landscape change across the 4 domains on the y-axis. So we have inspiration, social, natural, and financial returns along a continuum of time. And on the left, we see the red downward spiral, where we would observe a degree of degenerative dynamics unfolding. And for example, in this case, what we are looking at is events that lead to deforestation, can in turn lead to loss of employment, which in turn affects the loss of hope, and eventually outmigration. And then on the right in green, we see an upward spiral where we see regenerative dynamics unfolding. And here, what we could hypothesize is that financial investment that creates ecological restoration can lead to new opportunity for business development, and that in turn can lead to a sense of hope and therefore improved social resilience. So that's just one example. But a key question that I'm particularly interested in is, in pursuing these multiple benefits at the landscape scale, does the degree of integration matter? And is the implementation of these activities across the 4 impact domains in a coordinated way sufficient to generate these regenerative processes? Or do we need to think about how we can do that deliberately and systematically across all of these domains? And this has implications, of course, about how we finance and what we finance in restoration. In the paper, what we do is we take 2 landscape restoration cases where common land has been involved in, both since 2015. What the paper does is secondary sources review. We do a desk review of reports that identifies events, system variables, and changes in each of the 4 domains. And we map the interactions between events and systems variables over time. It's one of the components of the paper. And I just want to show you very quickly what this looks like. Here we take a very long timeline. You can see the project starts in 2015, but we hypothesize all the possible events and changes that happened before that. And so in 2015, well, throughout the entire timeline, what we see is different returns and losses represented by these text in red and green, and the arrows showing the interactions across domain. Interesting, I think, is how often events that happen that are not related to restoration beyond 2015, such as, for example, institutional investment, lead to positive reinforcement in restoration outcomes. So that is both in regenerative agriculture and ecosystem restoration. So this is, I think, quite interesting for those who are working in the sector, because there's the tendency to only invest in technical restoration activities. And here, this is the case for Spain, where, again, we see the temporal evolution from 2014. I've edited this, this graphic, but again, it also shows that investments outside the ecological restoration or ecosystem restoration leads to positive reinforcement in environmental outcomes. And just a few final thoughts. In this project, what we see is that there is evidence of positive mutual reinforcing interactions in landscape restoration. There is some evidence that this is happening. What we need to do next is of course, further empirical research that can really examine the nature of those cross-domain interactions, whether we can deliberately create different or foster and these synergies across domains. And so that would be a very interesting thing to take forward. A few thoughts about challenges that relate to this idea that in practice, ecosystem restoration is, we know, cross-domain and dynamic, yet most of the monitoring that is taking place, even at the landscape scale, looks at changes within domains. And this is problematic because, of course, it doesn't really allow us to foster and leverage cross-domain dynamics. And the other important challenge is, of course, the short-term project-based implementation, which doesn't facilitate analysis over time. And just a few questions for the breakout group is very much to think about how we can translate these dynamics, this thinking into ecosystem restoration, what challenges are likely to emerge, what does the framework influence or align with the broader policy or governance structures which we need to take this forward, and how we can leverage this to promote transformative change. And I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Victoria. And we'll go straight on to Caitlin. You're up, Caitlin. Thank you.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. Just sharing my screen here. To it before and pop you into presentation mode. All right.
Perfect.
So, hello, everyone. Just surround some, seeing everyone's faces as we do this. So hi and welcome. And thank you everyone so much for having me join today. It's been a real treat to be introduced to the team. So Stefan and Jorn in particular for reaching out about the event today. So what I'm about to present is a work in progress. So if you are a fellow researcher, I think you know that in the middle of doing something, when you've yet to get to your conclusions, it's a little bit vulnerable to present what it is. So both bear with me as we do this, but also please share your thoughts in the breakout groups because nothing's set in stone. Now on to the next slide. Oh, it's not moving. Give me 1 second. There we go. I was going to start with some groundwork, but I think we can skip that for now in the interest of time because we are all fairly well aligned, I think, today on what we're speaking about, and jump into more of the research questions. So we had questions looking towards established businesses and industries. We wanted to understand if we were to be putting regenerative dynamics and thinking into practice, how would we understand the business case for regenerative economy, the potential regenerative strategies and practices, but also how are they implemented? And so this was our broad framework. We were really curious about understanding use studies or application. And so to start this, we found in the first instance, some funding from Oxford and a corporate partner who was willing to ask these questions together about their work and give us access to some of their data and experiences on the ground. So the initial part of the project was actually sharing this data. And this is a large tea company that operates around the world, but in particular has a large footprint in Kenya. And so through that, we were able to understand several decades worth of data from their production on the ground there. We've also been conducting interviews across the tea industry, the range of stakeholders. And in March, we were able to do our first bit of field work. We went to Kericho, Kenya, where we were able to conduct interviews both within the corporate partnership and their organization, but also through connections to the county government and with smallholders throughout the region as well. On the tail of this, we conducted a research workshop where we've been trying to engage with other academics and civil society, and actually anyone who may have relevant concepts involved in their work, but not actually be perhaps interested in tea. And so I'm bringing you today into this presentation from that particular context. And as a crash course in tea, so you have a sense of what we're talking about in this business case study, a few high-level facts that might surprise you about tea in Kenya, because they did surprise us. Just to say how extensive tea production is across Kenya. So nearly 20 out of the 47 counties in Kenya grow tea. So you can see here they are predominantly located both to the west and the east of the Rift Valley. And tea is incredibly important to the Kenyan economy, contributing 21% of the export earnings, only behind tourism and foreign remittances. And it's also important to the global economy. 24% of the world's tea exports are coming out of Kenya. This is primarily the black CTC tea, or CTC is the processing term, the type of tea you end up getting in a tea bag that is in a fine or powdery form. And within Kenya, you have large tea estates, so international organizations, and they're grouped within organizations called the Kenyan Tea Growers Association, has over 20 members. You also have smallholders, over 600,000 smallholders across Kenya, selling their tea to both these large estates and also to an organization called the Kenya Tea Development Agency, which is a private company within Kenya. And tea itself all comes from the same plant, whether it's green tea, black tea, white tea, slightly different if it's purple tea. And its cultivation began in the 1800s. These are trees that are typically cropped and grown to be about 4 feet high, mostly a mix of hand harvesting and mechanized harvesting today. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, that piece in the top left, you'd cut off just the very top of that plant would be what you would harvest for the tea you would drink. And so why are we looking at tea in terms of a regenerative economy? Both an industry that is important economically to a country, has a global footprint, but also is an agronomic product and product that actually experiences very little processing and is sold to us very similar to how it is produced. How do we understand its relationship with both that important social context, but also its environmental footprint? And the key dynamics the industry is struggling with at the moment can be boiled down to a relatively stagnant price for tea in the marketplace, with rising labor costs, and also a growth of production base, so more and more people going into planting tea. And this therefore producing more supply to the market, but also keeping prices low. And so we've dubbed this in a more complicated way, the vicious cycle, and understanding the vicious cycle of the tea industry at the moment. We can see that low profits for producers are part of a cycle behind it in terms of increasing production, leading to more production, and then variables within it that are actually where the really interesting bits happen. And so you can see here at the very bottom, there's increasing yields. And what's going into increasing yields is not just more people making tea, but changes into how it's made, how agricultural productivity is changing as well. And within this process, although it's a vicious cycle, you can actually pick out that there are dynamics of it that are both degenerative and regenerative. But what we're seeing more value placed on are some of the degenerative aspects and less so the regenerative dynamics. And so trying to think through how do we actually increase the value that is placed on many of the regenerative dynamics in these pockets of change, and sort of decrease or minimize those regenerative aspects being so dominant in the value chain and in the way the industry is functioning. And in the interest of time, I won't go into all the nitty-gritty of tea, but just to say that some of the negative or degenerative features related to increasing costs, related to traditional hierarchies of power and structure of the industry itself, and also the incoming effects of climate change, have bits of change happening at smaller scales within the industry already. There is agronomic improvement in practices happening, be that from the reduction of glyphosate to minimal use of pesticides, and focuses on different types of organic and local fertilizers. And there's also an incredibly strong connection to the socioeconomic well-being of the country, provision of jobs, wages, and also that it's an industry that occurs at multiple scales of economic activity, both in terms of large multinationals and very smallholders who may only have this as part of a broader portfolio of products. And also at the landscape level, as the plantations in particular are appreciating the scale of the ecological services that these lands encompass. There are tens of thousands of hectares under tea production in Kenya. And so what we can see within this is that there are actually agronomic practices available that are supporting value. And we mean this value in the broad sense, so economic value, social value, and many other values that we can describe as positive regenerative dynamics, such as more efficient use of fertilizers, drought and pest resistance, and effective harvesting. And they're actually combating many of the things that are a threat to value, particularly commercial value, such as climate change, human rights dynamics, and pesticide threats. What we don't necessarily see is a way, these values are being translated into a shift for valuing, if you will, regenerative dynamics over degenerative dynamics. So some of the questions we're asking is, one is a question of quality. And so we're asking actually, what is the nature of the industry itself and the product that it's producing, and how is that understood in the market? Are we talking about, here I give examples that we've been looking into of different questions within how you make tea, how you understand what it is to the people who drink it and the people who produce it. So the quality of a product from production to the value of how it's consumed. Can we think differently about that? Are there ways of thinking differently about that itself? We also think about value capture. One of the things we're exploring is, how do you capture the value of regenerative dynamics over those of degenerative dynamics in an industry setting or in a market setting? And what we know now is valued to a degree good agronomic practice, but more sort of the value of a blend of tea, a brand of tea. And we know that in past experiments and practices around fair trade and organic, some have been unsustainable and some have just failed to grow and perhaps are not the future market spaces. So we've been exploring a bit, what would future markets that could more value regenerative dynamics look like? Would they require regulation and governance or certification or consumer education or marketing? And these are some of the different things we're exploring. We also look at some of the barriers. And one of the exercises we've been working through is understanding the barriers between the supply chain itself, where the growing and the factory processing stages and the good practices that are happening there actually have many barriers to being understood by customers and sales at the end of it. How do we change these dynamics across the system? And also perhaps as our third point is, how do we understand the industry as something that is more place-based and diversified? We see that in other products such as coffee or even wine, there's a sense of a terroir, a knowledge of where the product comes from, and an appreciation of difference that we don't see currently widespread across the tea industry outside specific areas such as perhaps Darjeeling or Assam or some other names of regions that produce a tea that you'll recognize. And so as a sort of incredibly fast tour of this project, but hopefully dropping in just tidbits of ideas of how we're trying to think about the application and unpicking of different dynamics within an industry sector. Those are some guiding points. I am speaking here particularly biased by my own training as an economic geographer, and then I'm often thinking about networks of flow of economic activity, the intensities and rates at which they're occurring, and the locations in which they're occurring, and how those factors influence them. And so my opportunities that I present will be biased towards those, but they include questions of how do you have broader social inclusion? How do we challenge the consistency of a product or a blend as being its ultimate value or its ultimate quality? Questioning the purchasing power of different geographies and their relevant connections to each other, and whether or not actually these different changes within an industry add up to a contribution that does move us towards a regenerative economy or not. What does it take? Does the business itself need to sort of hit all of the dimensions of regenerative practice, or is it more along the lines of industrial symbiosis, a key participant in an ecosystem where it needs to support the other players as well? I'll do one last example there and then leave it to questions, just to say, for example, if tea in Kenya is going to be more mechanized in the future, are there opportunities for the Kenyans who are displaced in the harvesting to then actually be trained to become the builders of these machines, the engineers, the executors of that next generation of talent that is needed in the area? So asking questions like this. I'd love to continue asking those questions with all of you when we move into the breakout groups. So essentially asking you the broad question we're asking is, what does it take to move an industry? But at the same time, maybe challenging some of the questions and the tensions between first movers and ecological, environmental versus the social dimensions. A question we have of continuous improvement, that as you hit different stages of equilibrium, as you move forward towards a more regenerative system, how do you progress? How do you not get stuck in what we've sometimes seen as certifications we have now that lead to static dimensions? And finally, I think the thorniest perhaps of all questions in these spaces is, how is it paid for? Where are these investments made from? How do they get cycled back into the system to support it itself? So yes, thank you. And I look forward to talking about it further.
Great. Thank you so much, Caitlin. And thanks to all three of you. We've now had an entrepreneurial perspective. We heard an ecosystem restoration perspective and now an economic geography perspective. So we can really get a sense for how thinking about regenerative systems is something that across different kinds of fields is currently capturing the imagination of people. And these are interesting conversations to be had.